So tonight we're doing a little bit of a special discussion, and this is something that I get asked about a lot, and I tend to forget. I've been doing this for years. People who've been following my work are following along for years, so they have a basic understanding when I put out posts on social media saying, hey, everyone, heads up, we're in 0 kp, or we have got a G2 geomagnetic storm coming, etc., etc. And I've had a lot of people recently reaching out to me saying, but what does that mean? I don't understand. So we're going to do, especially with the events of the last week, a little bit of a little party on the sun that happened this last week. So I want to run through this and do a basic presentation for everyone. This is the basics. I'm going to be talking in really simplified terms. I am not going to be going deep diving into all of the little itty bitty details, and I'm going to simplify things as much as I possibly can. So all the people who are into the solar physics stuff, don't judge me. I'm bringing this down to a very, very easy level. Okay, so let's go through some of the stuff I want to talk about. Like I said, we're going right to the beginning. This is the sun, the giant ball of burning gas, so we're told. And this is our planet Earth. This is obviously an artist's rendition. Earth is nowhere near this size in comparison to the sun. Our little ball is about the size of that teeny, teeny little red mark there. That's about how big Earth is in compared to the sun. But this image gives us a good indication because it's showing you in the blue lines, it's showing you the Earth's magnetic fields. And that's one of the main things we're going to be talking about tonight. So, like I said, we're going right to the basics. Earth is a giant magnet. Like all magnets, I'm not going to get into dipoles. Like most magnets, it has a north pole and it has a south pole. Something that a lot of people are confused about is that the magnetic North Pole is not the same as the geographical North Pole, and the same thing with the South Pole. They're two different points. And right now, with the movement of the North Pole, which we're not really going to get into tonight, those points are separating and becoming much, much farther apart. Okay? So the Earth's magnetic field around it is shaped like a torus. Again, great little artist rendering of what it would look like. The whole, we've all seen the torus, it looks like a donut. And you notice that the inner and the outer edges of it are the north and south pole of the planet. Okay? This is really important to comprehend because how the interaction happens when we start talking about solar flares, CMEs, etc., it's important to understand, even on a visual level, which is why I like that previous picture, how it works, why it affects us the way it does. So when we talk about the sun and solar flares, CMEs, which are coronal mass ejections, which I'll get into, and how they come in and affect our planet. So you can imagine there's the sun over here. Here's our planet and our geomagnetic field. Now, in front of the geomagnetic, the outer leading edge, if you will, is what we call the bow shock. That is what all the solar particles, the solar rays, cosmic rays coming in, hit into the bow shock. Okay? Inside, we have the magnetopause. We have the radiation belts, which are around Earth, the Van Allen belts. The plasma sphere, we've got a lot of different things. I'm not going to get into all the minutiae, the plasma sheet, the magneto tail. I want you to just to understand, because this image shows you, again, that torus shape. The shape on the side of the torus of Earth that's facing the sun is very rounded and sometimes very, very compressed because of solar winds, because of what's energies that are coming from the sun. Whereas you can see the geomagnetic shield on the back of the Earth kind of trails out off, it forms a tail, if you will. Normally, when our geomagnetic shield, which is like Earth's force field, normally when it is at prime capacity, it's strong, it's working really, it's doing its job. What happens is you will have these energies. You can imagine these blue lines are the energies coming in off the sun. They can be high charged particles, radiation, ultraviolet, gamma rays, X-rays, cosmic rays that can be coming in this direction. They hit the bow shock, and that force field, if you will, just pushes them all off, and they go around the outer edge, and they leave our little blue marble alone for the most part. But when the geomagnetic shield is a little bit weaker or has openings in it, which does happen, what happens is you have these particles come in, and some of them start to siphon, and you can see it, a little opening here at the top and the bottom, and those particles get sucked in to the center of the toroidal field. You can see it a little better here with the line drawing. So again, the solar winds are coming in, you see them coming through, and oh, they get sucked in, and they're being pulled down into the magnetic north and south poles, which charges the planet. And we're not going to get into that today, because that's another whole massive big discussion that I just don't want to get into at the moment. So this is what happens when we have these things happen. We have all these incoming solar wind particles. They can charge up. You get radiation. We have proton storms that can happen, and geomagnetic storms. Geomagnetic storms are when we're getting just pummeled by these energies that are coming off the sun. So I want to show you, this is the sunspot. This last week, we have just kind of entered into solar cycle 25. The solar cycles are 11-year cycles. We're in solar cycle 25. And we're starting to see, as we're going into the maximum of the solar cycle, which means there's a lot more activity on the sun, a lot more sunspots, a lot more active regions, we're seeing more magnetically mixed spots appearing on the sun. When we get these magnetically mixed or charged spots appearing on the sun, like this one that you see right here, this was on Thursday, sunspot 2887. They don't have names, they all just get numbers. We got hit on the 28th with an X-class solar flare. And it's the first major solar flare of this cycle. So it was the heads up shot. This was the shot that everyone's been kind of waiting for. That's almost like the gun on the starting line going off to say, aha, welcome to solar cycle 25. The party is about to begin. This is where we saw the region of all the activity. Not just this spot, but multiple other spots were also shooting off solar flares. The X-class solar flare shot off and brought out a CME. CME is a coronal mass ejection. Now I'm just going to take a quick pause here. Solar flares are given strength values. So you have C-class flares are numbered from 1 to 9. And then when you get to C-class 9, you go into M-class flares, which are numbered from 1 to 9. And that's your going up in your strengths of how powerful the solar flare is. After the M-class, you have X-class. X class is when we're starting to get into very dangerous areas of amount of energy that is being blown off. X class has no top. They just go up. We do. It's not like a 1 to 9. It's 1 to 45, 1 to 52. So when you hear us talking about, we've had an M class solar flare, we've had an X class solar flare, it gives you an idea of the strength. Now, one of the things I'm going to get into further on in here is that we're in a solar minimum, a grand solar minimum that we're going into. And because of that, the geomagnetic shields of the planet are very, very weak. So in the previous solar cycle 24, back in 2012, 2013, when I was doing these discussions and someone would say, oh, we had a C-class solar flare, I'd be like, it was a hiccup. C-class? Oh, M-class? When we get to an M5, 6, 7, 8, talk to me then. Anything below an M5, I'm not even going to pay attention to. Since then, though, our geomagnetic shields have gotten much weaker around the planet. So therefore, these solar flares that are coming in are much more geo-effective, you could say. They have a much bigger punch now because our force field is much weaker. So we have seen pretty big geomagnetic storms coming in from small little C-class solar flares. Again, that's because of the weakening of the shield. Okay, so we're going to dive over here. When the solar flare went off, it sent out a coronal mass ejection, which is basically the sun throwing out a massive amount of plasma, of X-rays, gamma rays, all different kinds of energies. It was almost, and we talk about this in the form of a halo, this was a partial halo CME that sent out. So this is a satellite graph. The little white circle shows you the size of the sun, is where the sun is, and it is blacked out on the satellite so that they can look at the energies that are coming out. Because if they don't have the sun blacked out, the brightness of the sun makes it too bright for them to be able to see what's actually happening. So you can see here, when this blast went off, it literally almost, let's say 3/4 of the way around the sun is affected. And this was directly Earth facing. This was a directly Earth facing event, and it came through and it hit us on the weekend. Now, do you remember when I showed you the diagram of the particles coming in and going into the poles? Immediately when the solar flare happened, I won't say immediately, let's say relatively quickly when the solar flare happened, we had radio blackout and we had a radiation storm and a proton storm. Now it hit facing directly into South America, and then you see as it goes and bleeds off, the proton storm is then in the North Pole and the South Pole. Now, to give us an idea of the strength of those proton storm and the radiation storm, the storm conditions continued through until the 31st, which it's been a long, long time since I've seen it extend for that long of those conditions continuing for days. Okay. This is our measurement of geomagnetics. So you will hear me talk about, I'll say to people, we are at something KP. KP is the measurement. It comes from a German word, KP, which I'm not even going to, it's written down here below. If you want to try and pronounce it, have at her. It's a measurement of the geomagnetic activity in the atmosphere from a 0 to a 9. 0 being extremely low, dangerously low. 9 being an extremely high. And when we talk about geomagnetics, it's the extreme low and highs that cause us problems. So when I say we're at KP 0, I'm letting you know that we're at the lowest end of the spectrum, and we'll talk about that in just a couple of minutes. The other measurement you hear me talk about is we are going to have a geomagnetic storm. We are expecting a G2, a G3 storm. That is a measure of severity of the actual geomagnetic storm. So a G1 is just a minor storm going up to a G5, which is an extreme geomagnetic storm. So I just wanted to give you a basic idea of what I'm talking about. The KP is kind of like the measurement of the power, if you will, of what level our geomagnetics are at versus the storm readings, which are the Gs, G1, G2, G3, which tells you how powerful the storm is that is coming in from the sun. So here's the problem. This is, people ask me why do I talk about, and have been talking about this for close on to 10 years. We have health risks that come along with radiation storms, solar flares, geomagnetic storms, proton storms. Each one of these things has directly affects health. Okay, so I want to talk about these, and you will understand why in a lot of the shows over the last year, I have been asking questions about the so-called coronavirus. When we talk about radiation storms, such as the one we had on the weekend, high-risk patients, cardiac, cardioventricular dysfunction, infraction, arrhythmia, strokes, including fluctuations in heart rate and blood pressure, psychiatric, including suicide, anxiety, depression, and bipolar outbursts, autoimmune exacerbation in arthritis, lupus, epidermal and glandular. And glandular is a really interesting one. I want you to keep that in mind. All biological life at risk of seizures, migraines, cognitive diminution of risks. Okay, cognitive diminution, that means you can't think straight. You start, it's that thing when you go walk into the kitchen, you're like, what did I come in here for? What was I doing? Why do I have these scissors in my hand? What was I going to cut? Which we talk about a lot. Airline passengers, and this is a major one, at a high risk of all the listed hazards. Basically, if you were in the air over South America when that radiation storm hit on the 28th, you have got a very large dose of radiation, proton storm. We have to deal with all these risks. Anything that we felt here up in the air on airplanes, where you just have a thin little covering of an airplane shell around you, much higher risks. Now, the same thing with solar flares. Okay, high-risk patients, psychiatric exacerbations, including suicide, anxiety, depression, bipolar, autoimmune, including lupus, digestive, glandular again, all biological life, seizures, migraines, cognitive diminution, again, visual impairments, reaction time diminution. Okay, now this is interesting. Reaction times. When your reaction times are slowed down, how many times have we talked about the fact of how many car accidents we've seen? This is a major one, because if there's one thing where you need your reaction times to be spot on, it's when you're driving. This is an official piece that came out from NASA talking about this. Now you look up here and you look at your safe zones and your geomagnetic storms. So when we are sitting here looking, 0 in geomagnetic storms is just as dangerous as a storm, a 7 or an 8 kp storm. And this is what is one of our biggest health problems that we've been seeing a lot of, especially over the last 2 years. We've had a lot of 0 kp days. As a matter of fact, when that X-class flare hit, we had been bouncing in and out between 0 and 1 kp for 3 days prior to. That means we spiked from 0 up into radiation proton storm status very quickly. And a lot of people have talked about the physical effects and how they've been feeling over the last few days. Again, we have a lot of studies coming out now talking about the direct effects between space weather and, pardon me, strokes, heart attacks, mental breakdowns. On days of zero KP indices describing geomagnetic activity accompanied by high cosmic rays activity, more medical emergencies and total death number daily occurred. Sudden cardiac deaths and cerebral strokes show a strong trend to a significant rise and an absolute increase in number of acute myocardial infarction. Just keep it in your mind. I'm going to post this to YouTube, so we're not going to use the words. What else have we been hearing about nonstop that causes heart attacks, strokes, and myocardial infarctions? There's a lot of information, and I've been seriously down a rabbit hole on and off for the last few months, looking at the history of solar cycles and their effects, not just on the planet, because there is a very, very well seen, easily seen wave that comes through in these cycles: volcanoes, earthquakes, floods, droughts, storms, massive storms, hurricanes run and are directly affected by these solar cycles that we go through. But there's also physical effects on humans, influenza pandemics, and solar activity cycles. The association between these cycles and the Great Plagues, the Justinian plague, the Black Plague, and the plague of the 1800s. There's a lot more people are starting to finally start look at these pieces, because it's not just as straightforward. It's not as simple as we're led to believe. There are a lot more factors involved in this. And when you start looking at these cycles, it's astounding. It is truly astounding. Now, this is interesting as well. Biological effects of space radiation and the development of effective countermeasures. Now, this is specifically talking about astronaut health, but cosmic rays are cosmic rays. And they talk about the fact later on in this article, they do talk about ground penetrating cosmic rays as well. And they talk about what the physical biological effects are. And they talk about things for example, gene expression changes, changes to your genes, programmed cell death, extracellular matrix remodeling. I'm not going to get into the real technical stuff. Oxidative stress, very, very important. Gastrointestinal tract bacterial location and immune system activation. Blood coagulation. That means blood clots. Skin problems. Keep that in mind. Behavior. Fatigue. Heart functions. Vision problems. And long-term effects such as cancer. All of these pieces are all subjects that we've been talking about an awful lot over the last couple of years, last few years, actually. Now, I mentioned the fact about being in a solar minimum. Our solar cycles are 11 years. The sun goes through an 11-year cycle where it's low, it's high, it's low, it's high, it's low. But on top of the 11-year cycle, you have bigger cycles. And in these cycles, we have what we call solar minimums, like grand solar minimums, where it's not an 11-year cycle, where the effects on the sun last for decades. And this is where we see things. So, for example, in the Maunder minimum, which is the last major minimum that we had, which happened in the mid-1600s, is when there was a mini ice age. It's when the Thames River froze over, when the canals in Amsterdam froze over. There's a lot of effects that went on with this. Okay, we're coming into what was the mainstream was originally saying over the last few years that the next minimum that we're looking at going into 2045, 2050. But newer data is coming out, and of my opinion as well, is that we're going into the next Maunder minimum, if you will, right now, which means a lot of major effects that are going to happen on the planet. Now, this is a really old graphic. This is from like early mid 2000s, 2003, I think. So don't look when they start talking about fossil fuel emissions over there in the upper corner. Just ignore that part. This was during all that time. The one thing about this that is really good is that it talks about, it gives you a very smoothed out graph. It's roughed in. This isn't all your little teeny spikes that we saw on the other one. It's just giving you the basic movement of going from the cold to the warm cycles. And there's some basic things that we see. Now, this is focused mostly on volcanic activity, but we're going to fill in some blanks here. Okay. I want you to look, we're not going to go and look at the way in BC timescale. We go over here, we talk about the Roman Empire after 0 AD, going up to the Roman Empire. Okay. The first major minimum that happened began in about 450, 550. In 535, we have Krakatoa blows out. Now, they're talking about this is that there was at least 10 other eruptions between 535 and 550. This is really, really important because these were major eruptions. At the exact same time as this is also the exact same marker when the Justinian plague broke out in 550 to 555. And then we see it comes down here in the minimums. You go through, and as you start coming back up the other side, we have another outbreak of plague. We have another whole bunch of markers of more major volcanic eruptions. Then we get up here, and we've got the warm set in 13 AD. We drop down the other side, and we get to 1335 as we start going into the next minimum. Also, 1335 is the beginning of, or very close to the beginning of, the Black Plague. And again, 24 major eruptions in Italy, the Pacific, Alaska, and Iceland of major volcanic eruptions. Now, as we got down here into the 1600s, which was your Maunder minimum, we got really cold. And as you can see, as we start coming back up, we have a lot of eruptions. When we get to the 1800s, as we're coming back out of this minimum stage, is the next plague that took place in the late 1800s. Now, you can see this graph is, like I said, it's old. It only goes up to really 2000, 2002. And they're hypothesizing, they're talking the drop here of 2020 will be colder, question mark, because we're now dropping down into the next minimum. I've done a lot of research looking at these solar minimums and the plagues that happened during those times. And of course, the physical ramifications, because we also had massive amounts of volcanoes, earthquakes, droughts, wildfires, etc. You also have famine. Where you have famine, you have people not eating well. Therefore, you have a breakdown within people's ability to have their immune system deal with the viruses and bacteria that are around them. So if they're already compromised through mass starvation and And with the volcanoes, it's hypothesized that would have caused a lot of vitamin D deficiency because of all the ash in the air. It kind of leaves an open door for these plagues to break out and sweep through like they did. I'm going to talk about that a lot more tomorrow night on the Unfuck It discussion. So going back to solar flares, this is a little bit important, and I just want to touch on this quickly. Back in 1859, there was the Carrington event. It was a huge solar flare. It's hypothesized because we didn't have the equipment to really be able to measure it then. It was hypothesized, they figured that it was about an X45. Now, when this solar flare happened, we didn't have, in 1859, we didn't have electronics. We didn't have the power grid that we have today. We didn't have that kind of technology. And yet, when this solar flare hit and the geomagnetic storm that came with it, it wiped out telegraph lines. It wiped out telegraph lines so much so that the papers in the telegraph machines caught on fire. And when they unplugged the batteries to try and disconnect everything, there was so much energy in the line still from the geomagnetic storm that they were still receiving telegrams along the lines, even though they were unplugged from the batteries. Now, we've had a couple of major ones in recent times. In 2003, there was an X-class 28 X-class flare. And on September 6th in 2017, you guys may have remembered me doing a big show on this one, we had a 9.3 X-class solar flare. Both those solar flares were not Earth-facing. They were not directly Earth-facing. In both cases, the sunspot had rotated around the limb, and what we got hit with was a glancing blow. In 1989, when we had a geomagnetic storm that took down the power grid in Quebec, Canada, for several days, almost the entire of the province went without power. That was a glancing blow of a lower X-class solar flare that was not directly Earth-facing. So this is why we talk about the fact of, this is one of the reasons why I talk about being prepared. One of the main reasons why I talk about being prepared. We now live in a society that is completely tied to computers, internet, electricity, Wi-Fi, etc. When we talk about solar flares coming in, and these kind of major solar flares, there is that risk that a magnetic storm of a high enough strength, if we start talking about a G3, G4, G5 category geomagnetic storm, that could be enough to literally wipe out power grids on the planet. Not just that, people don't realize we're talking about plumbing lines could just explode from the pipes that are in the ground. Computers, which, what happens when you run a magnet over a computer? Not good things. Now, on the good side of things, unlike the Carrington event, we now have satellites, and satellites will give us any kind of a solar event. We usually get at least 6, if not 12 to 18 hours warning of an event like this incoming, because the geomagnetic storms that come through on the CMEs take time to reach us. They're not an instantaneous thing. So there is preparation time. So, like I said, I just wanted to lay out the basics. Now, all the papers that I showed you are all in the Unfuckers library. I have put a pile of books in the Unfuckers library dealing with this exact topic, specifically historical, looking at the plague, looking at all these solar minimums and physical events that have taken place. Comets are another common one that they talk about all through history, but they're all available in the Unfuckers library. So it's all there for you to check out. Now, tomorrow on the Unfuck It discussion, I will open the floor for major conversation. And that will be available. All of this video and the video of tomorrow's show will be available on RTS.Earth, and you can go check it out there.